James Bond films are one of a kind. They are entertaining, cool, and sophisticated. The plot is always intriguing. The set pieces are always grand and beautiful. The gadgets and cars that are used are always fun and awesome to see. And the scenes between Bond and the villain are always exciting. The intense action, funny quips, subtle mind games, amazing chase scenes, and the climactic showdowns. These moments are what define Bond films and explains how they have been successful and great for so long, and why I love them so much. I grew up watching Daniel Craig's Bond films. I remember watching Casino Royale back in 2006 and was so mesmerized by it that it turned me into a James Bond and Daniel Craig fan for life. I think this is also the movie that got me hooked on the spy action genre, because from then on, I started watching a few other James Bond, Jason Bourne, and Mission Impossible movies. I also followed closely the succeeding Craig movies, from Quantum of Solace up to No Time to Die. My interest just never goes away. Out of all the Craig movies, Casino Royale is the Bond film that I love the most. I rewatch it every year, and never once did I feel tired of watching the entire movie over and over again. Not one scene is boring, nor were any of the characters. In this video, I will try to analyze why that is, what made this movie so great and enjoyable that I am always excited to watch it. Casino Royale is unlike the majority of Bond films, for it is an origin story, a film where Bond is not yet the legendary MI6 spy. He had just received the 00 status, so, in a way, he was still somewhat of a rookie. His judgment and character still need developing, and it was perfectly shown throughout the film as he continually makes poor judgment on his missions.
Bond, this may be too much for a blunt instrument to understand, but arrogance and self-awareness seldom go hand in hand.
So you want me to be half monk, half hitman?
He finally becomes the 007 that we know and love at the end of the film. After everything that transpired, the good and the bad changed him for the better. What I love about this is that the film is not all dependent on the plot. Bond is changing and growing with each new mission, and his character development reflects on the actions he takes. After watching the film a few times, I realized that the Bond at the latter part of the film is not the same one at the start. When I was a kid, I loved the chase and fight scenes of the film. Now that I am an adult, I am now more interested in the story and the characters. Either way, Casino Royale has always been entertaining for me because it's got both of those things. It's not just a generic spy action movie where the protagonist needs to beat the villain in order to save the world. Another reason why Casino Royale is so great is because it has one of the best Bond villains of the entire franchise, Le Chiffre. A glorified accountant and banker for many terrorists, his ability to be menacing does not come from having a secret hideout and a great number of hitmen at his command, like many of the other Bond villains. Rather, it was his cunning and cruelty, in which he got Bond and almost killed him if it wasn't for Mr. White's surprise visit. Unlike the other Bond villains, Le Chiffre is more rooted to the ground, more vulnerable and reachable to Bond. At one point, Bond was even ready to outright kill him, but he was stopped by Felix. Le Chiffre's status in the criminal underworld is slowly revealed as the movie progresses, and we see that he has his own problems as well, being in debt by losing his clients' money. Someone as brilliant as him rarely makes mistakes in where he invests his clients' money. Only this time, he fell under Bond's radar, who thwarted his plan on manipulating the stock market by bombing a plane. The consequences of this failure caused him to fall under unpleasant situations, driving him to the point of desperation. This is where he is at his most cruel and dangerous. At this point, he has more to lose than Bond, because literally, it is his life is what's at stake. That's what made him so dangerous, because it has become personal. He needed Bond to get the money and save himself. This desperation made their interactions more intense and anxiously real. Another thing that made Le Chiffre stand out as a villain is how he and Bond were dealing blows to one another through the stylishly intellectual game of poker. There is no hand-to-hand combat, nor any grand chase scenes, only two men using their wits and intelligence to outplay one another. It is very refreshing and engaging to watch because, since they are not outright dealing with each other, the tension between the two of them can be stretched throughout many scenes, which made watching the film more captivating. Even in the torture scene, Bond is not fighting back nor trying to get out. He was just bravely exchanging pleasantries with Le Chiffre, while both of them talk about what's going to happen to each other. Even their first meeting was sophisticated and harmless.
And you must be Mr. Bliss's replacement. Welcome, Mr. Beach. Or is that Bond? I'm a little confused.
Well, we wouldn't want that, would we?
By this time, I think Le Chiffre already knows who Bond is, and yet, he still decided to play poker with him. Since he is a gifted mathematician, he is confident that he can beat Bond using his own skills and nothing else, which he did, until Bond came back in the game and beat him. Since the name of the film is Casino Royale, the highlight is of course the casino-related scenes, particularly the highly tense showdown between Bond and Le Chiffre. What I love about this is that it's unlike some of the previous Bond movies where he is studying how to break down the villains by either openly or stealthily fighting his way through the villain's schemes. Instead, Bond is trying to bring down Le Chiffre by studying him closely throughout the poker games, trying to find some moment of weakness or vulnerability. It is like a small Cold War between the both of them, where they know they have the power to take down each other, but instead tries to deal with them indirectly. The best example of this is when Le Chiffre's wife put something in Bond's drink that made him almost go into cardiac arrest. They thought they have finally dealt with Bond until he came back and said one of, if not, the best lines in the Daniel Craig era.
I'm sorry. That last hand nearly killed me.
Other than the amazing villain, one of the best highlights of this film, of course, includes our hero, James Bond. The action and fight scenes of Casino Royale are one of the best I've ever seen. I've watched some of the previous James Bond films, and I can honestly say that the Daniel Craig films are mostly better when it comes to those categories. The action and fight scenes are raw, gritty, and realistic. It really captures the dangers of being James Bond. Almost every fight feels like there will be no winners, until Bond gets the edge for just a second and beats his opponent. That's why the fights are so exciting to watch. Amazingly, the fights were consistently breathtaking, and the first fight from the first scene would probably be my favorite, because that scene established the kind of James Bond Daniel Craig would be. Ruthless and efficient. The following action scenes throughout the movie would be equally great as well, especially the Madagascar chase scene, which I think is the best one in the Daniel Craig era. Skyfall's Istanbul chase scene would come at a close second, but the reason why the Madagascar chase scene was so good was because of two things. First, the film managed to beautifully blend together two contrasting things, the intense chase scene and the stunning tropics of Madagascar. Second, the scene showed Bond's physical attributes partnered with his ability to think quickly on more efficient ways to catch his enemies. Even though he is not as athletic as the bomb maker, he still managed to keep up with him and eventually catch him. This was such a great scene created by the writers because it added more on James Bond's character rather than it being a normal, plot-driven chase and fight scene. The last chase and fight scene that I want to talk about was the Miami airport one. It's one of my favorite scenes ever in any James Bond film. I remember when I first watched it and was just on the edge of my seat the whole time. From the time the water sprinklers were released up to the detonating of the bomb, the tension was consistent. The stakes were high and James Bond delivered. There were times when I thought that Bond was going to fail because the bomber had the edge on each of their encounter. But James Bond is James Bond, and the best thing about this was that his brilliantness was shown again when he nimbly attached the bomb on the bomber's pants. That was such a satisfying ending. In this film, Bond just became a 00 agent. He was not yet the legendary James Bond that he will become, and I loved how the film addressed this by Bond being continually told that his ego gets in the way of his job, that he is trigger-happy, arrogant, and reckless. And they were right. Some of Bond's actions throughout the film reflected those same words. The most notable ones I can remember were storming an embassy and killing a person while still inside the place, and when he rejected the alias given to him by MI6 in Montenegro, instead registering in the hotel using his real name. Bond is an interesting character in this film. He does his job well as an MI6 agent. He catches bomb makers, prevents the explosion of a prototype plane that would have crashed the stock market, kills terrorist freedom fighters, and won against a terrorist banker in a high-stakes game of poker, therefore preventing the banker to regain his money back and directly finance terrorism. However, his ways of doing his job is questionable, in which he often leaves a trail of destruction. Add also his arrogance and overconfidence, and it would seem like his line to M at the start of the film would come true.
Well, I understand double O's have a very short life expectancy, so your mistake will be short-lived.
It did happen, or rather, it almost happened. His overconfidence led him to put himself in danger, wherein he got in a horrific car crash and tortured afterwards. Throughout the film, it looked like Bond will arrogantly never learn his lesson. Everything changed, however, when Vesper came along. Vesper is one of, if not, the best Bond girl in the franchise. She is intelligent, assertive, and courageous. She was the only other person, other than M, who called out Bond on his ego. When he lost against Le Chiffre in the poker game, she stood her ground and didn't provide Bond with more funding for the next one. Bond is probably not used to being declined by women in anything, which angered him. Vesper was right, however, and Bond was able to clear his head and win the game. Vesper was a perfect partner for Bond. She was the person that changed him for the better. He became more empathetic towards other people other than himself, and surprisingly, Bond fell in love with her. It led him to think about life beyond the service to Queen and country, and he eventually resigned. As we all know, their plans of settling down did not pan out. Instead, Bond learned his most valuable lesson at the end of the film when he was talking to M. Trust no one, because you can never really know a person in this job. With that, Bond decided to come back to MI6. 007 has returned, more focused and ruthless than ever.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
The character development that Bond went through is one of the many reasons why I consider Casino Royale as the best film in the Daniel Craig era. From a raw 007 agent who does what he wants for the sake of the mission without thinking about the consequences of his actions, whether it be deciding to kill a bad guy on a whim or nonchalantly using other people without thinking twice about their safety, to a man who has learned to keep his ego in check thanks to the important people around him, therefore becoming more focused and careful on his missions, and most importantly, to a man who has become more empathetic towards other people. What's more impressive is that the results of Bond's character development can be seen on the following films. He was a good and understanding partner for Camille in Quantum of Solace. Then in Skyfall, even though Moneypenny shot him down, almost killing him, he was still showing concerns for her when she mentioned about going back in the field. Bond also showed care for Severine, a former sex slave, and even offered to help her get out. Of course, we cannot forget about Madeline in Spectre and No Time to Die, the perfect example. Even though she is the daughter of Mr. White, Bond still listened to his enemy's plea to save her. The care that Bond showed for those people can be traced back from his character development in Casino Royale. I found him to be more complex and interesting because of this, which made watching the next films more thoroughly enjoyable. To add more on Casino Royale's already impressive resume on why it's one of the best Bond films, I would like to talk about a particular scene that showed what kind of character James Bond truly is. The torture scene is the last showdown between Bond and Le Chiffre. It's not the typical high adrenaline fight between Bond and the villain, yes, but this scene is so much more interesting for me because it revealed both of their characters for who they truly are. Here, we find that Le Chiffre is not so powerful after all. Even though he is usually calm and collected, when he has his back against the wall in fear of much more powerful people, he shows his true colors. He resorts to kidnapping and torturing both Bond and Vesper as a last desperate attempt to get the money that he lost from Bond in order to pay his terrorist superiors. Bond, on the other hand, impressively stood his ground, proving his loyalty to MI6 and to Queen and country. Even when he was scared and in extreme agony, he didn't lose his composure entirely. Amazingly, he still maintained his cool personality and managed to deliver some hilarious quips to the chief that really made him angry.
Now the whole world's gonna know that you died scratching my balls. Well,
Bond only changed his demeanor when he heard Vesper scream, which showed an improvement from his cold character earlier in the film. This scene perfectly encapsulates what kind of man James Bond is, hence why I love it so much. Hopefully I have explained well why Casino Royale is the best Bond film of the Daniel Craig era. I understand that this is subjective and other people have different tastes, but for masterpieces such as this film, no one can objectively say that Casino Royale is a bad film, because it is not.